Hi everyone, I'm Heather and that's Chantel, and we're Book Wild.
Today we are coming at you with the mid-year book Freakout tag, and I am so excited to be doing this because I've been watching BookTube for years and I've seen this trend go around so much and I've always wanted to do it. So here we are.
So we belatedly realized that we did not include some context for our mid-year book Freakout, so we wanted to give you guys some stats for our video.
I think some people do this, not everybody does this, but we wanted to include it. So
Yeah.
Start us off.
Sure. So I read, so far this year, I have read 33 books, 4 of which were 5-star reads, 18 of which were 4-star reads, 9 of which were 3-star reads, 2 of which were 2-star reads, and 0 were 1 stars. Of the 33 books that I've read, 2 were nonfiction, 11 were thrillers or mysteries, 2 were memoirs, 5 were fantasies, 3 were classics, and 10 were just general fiction. I don't really like subgenre of my fiction because that seems hard for me.
I read 45 books so far this year, 7 5 stars, 18 4 stars, 6 3 stars. I was for sure surprised at those 2 numbers. 5 2 stars and 1 1 star. I also had 8 memoirs or nonfiction that I did not rate.
We both have 18 4 stars. That's cute.
Wow! Of the 45 books I've read, 2 were short story collections, 2 were sci-fi, I had 1 romance, 2 poetry books, 4 classics, 4 contemporary, 1 essay collection, 14 fantasies, 5 fiction, 3 graphic novels, 2 historical fiction, 4 memoirs, and 6 nonfictions. I also had 2 DNFs, which are included in those genres. And I'm currently in the middle of 3 books, which is also considers those genres. That's it.
Okay, bye.
So the first question is, what is the best book you've read so far this year?
I chose The Color Purple by Alice Walker. We have a full book review, book talk about this book that we will link up there
In the card.
And so I'm not going to go into detail about it, but I adored this book. This is a book that I will reread over and over and over.
And I chose Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón for the best book I've read this year. Also, I would say this is probably an all-time fave, one of the best books I've read my entire life, not just this year. I read this, I listened to the audiobook and absolutely loved it. I just finished it last week and I cannot wait to reread it.
Yay! I'm so happy that Chantel likes this book. I read it in college and I remember loving it, but I'm rereading it now because of how much she loved it, that I'm like, well, shit, I want to pick it back up. Yeah.
Cool. So the second question is, what is the best sequel you've read so far this year?
So I've only read 1 sequel this year, so by default, my choice is The Testaments by Margaret Atwood. And I read this in this was actually the first book I read this year. And I remember I liked it. I have no specific memories really of it. I enjoyed reading it while I was reading it, but can't remember a single thing.
Oh no.
So, but it was the best sequel. The only sequel. What was yours?
The best sequel I've read this year is Wires and Nerve Gone Rogue, Volume 2 in the spin-off series from the Lunar Chronicles. This was on our June Shoots and Ladders TBR. I picked Get Graphic, and I've had this book for years, and just haven't picked it up because it's been a while since I've read the Lunar Chronicle series. But it was so nice to pick up this book. This is a series that is for the younger end of young adult, so I would say like for 10 to 13-year-olds. But it was just so sweet and light, and I had a lot of fun getting back into these characters in the story, and it was really cute. I loved it. And I also haven't read many other sequels. I think I read one other sequel this year. So, but yeah, this was so cute. I loved it. The third question is a new release from the first half of the year that you haven't gotten to yet but want to. And for this one, we both picked the same book, which was My Dark Vanessa
by Kate Elizabeth Russell.
This book is, I think, making the rounds on BookTube. It is about a
young girl who has a relationship with a professor, and she's like realizing as she grows up that it wasn't appropriate and why, right?
Something along those lines, yeah. I think a lot of people, I think it's now getting mixed reviews. At first it was getting really good reviews.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to pick it up and see what it's about. And also we have very different views on things, so I'm excited to read this one potentially at the same time to see like what we each think of it.
Yeah. And I read Lolita a while ago, and I loved that book, not because it's an easy book to read, but because I think this similar reasons that people love this book. I think as long as you can cover a topic like this appropriately, it can be really meaningful without like fetishizing
and
pedophilia or anything like that.
And I think that's like a lot of the praise that I've heard for this book is that in dealing with the topic of an age gap romance, the realizations that the main character comes to later in life when she's looking back on this relationship is very insightful, and there's a lot of self-work being done there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I'm interested to see if that's true.
Me too.
Cool. The fourth question is the most anticipated release for the second half of the year.
And we do not have one.
Chantel from the editing room here. I just wanted to pop in and say I don't know what I was talking about. There are a few books that I am looking forward to later in this year, so I'll pop them on the screen now. And yeah, I'm excited for those.
We both don't really pick up new releases that often. We just kind of read books as we hear about them. The only books that I've really followed throughout my life is like, oh, they're coming out this day, like I'm gonna pre-order it, whatever, have been like the Harry Potter series, the Gentleman Bastard series, and the Game of Thrones series. So I'm waiting on those two series to end, and they're the only ones that I've kind of tracked throughout my book life.
Yeah.
Not if there's any new releases that we should be excited about, send them our way.
Yeah. The fifth question is, what is our biggest disappointing read of the year?
So I have two disappointing reads for this year. The first is The Deep by River Solomon. I was so excited to read this book. I read it. I chose this as a replacement for our June TBR for a book that was set at sea. Originally, I chose The Shipping News, but I wanted to support a Black author, as well as it was Pride Month, so also supporting authors of the LGBTQIA+ community. So I picked this up, and it's about slave women who were thrown overboard or jumped overboard, and their children become this like underwater society, and they cannot collectively handle their history and their past. It's too painful for them, so they select one person as a historian to hold all of the history for them and to take on the brunt of that emotion, like the historical pain that they have. And I thought the premise of this book was amazing, sounded amazing. This felt like a combination of The Giver and The Shape of Water, because, you know, it's similar, like the premise is similar to The Giver with the historian, and then there's like The Shape of Water is like relationships between a human and this like fish creature. And I just had so many issues with the way that this book was written. Not the premise. I loved the premise.
It sounds so cool.
Yeah, and there's non-binary characters and like a queer relationship, and I was like, I'm all for it, but I just did not like the way it was written for me. I just was very disappointed by this book. I gave it 2 stars. And then my second biggest disappointment was Wilder Girls by Rory Power. I know I've talked about what this book is about, but really quickly, it's about girls who are quarantined on an island, and there is a tox that's going around that like disfigures their body, and there's queer relationships and friendships. Again, super great premise. I love the premise, but it was just it didn't do it for me. The writing in this was just, it missed the mark for me. I felt like there were tons of sweeping generalizations that were made. All of the girls had the same personality. They were all like strong, independent, closed off, but loving women. And I love that, but not when they're all like the same. Oh, and then there's like this weird thing about climate change thrown in, which I love. Like, that's like my jam, but it was so just like rushed and not like, it didn't land with me, which is like something that would land with me. Yeah. So and I think if I had just picked these up and I hadn't heard so much about them previous to picking them up, I don't think I would have been as disappointed, even though I still think I would have been disappointed because the premise for both of them sounds so great. Yeah. But they just didn't connect with me. I'm sure that I don't think they were bad books, but for me, they weren't for me.
Yeah. My most disappointing book of the year was The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. This was my first Erin Morgenstern, who is also known for writing The Night Circus. I had The Night Circus, which I have since read, on my shelves, but this was super hyped at the end of last year, so I picked it up and was really, really excited to get to it. I've heard that just Erin Morgenstern's writing is so magical and lyrical and beautiful, and you really feel for the characters, and that is something I love in books. So I was like, I need to go pick this up and I need to read it. So I read it this year, and I didn't like anything about this book. So this is about a boy who finds a door. I don't even remember.
The
Far Beneath.
cover's really pretty.
It's gorgeous. Look at this book.
That's beautiful.
It's beautiful. Like, I read this book, and even reading the synopsis, like, I don't know what this is about. So generally, this book is about a boy who finds a book, which is essentially the book of his life, and it leads him to this secret society beneath the surface of the earth. And there's a lot of mystery and intrigue, and he's got to uncover a lot of information and talk to different people about the different aspects of this society, and things like appearing and disappearing doors and the symbolism of keys and bees. And there was so much interwoven, and that's one of my favorite things in books, are when there's dual timelines and
different storylines that are woven together, I don't think it was well done. There was so many characters, and I'm a person that loves character-driven books. Like, I connect with characters, I think, pretty easily, but the author's got to convince me.
Right.
And I did not care about a single character. And it was very confusing. There were stories. I remember at the beginning of this, there's a story, and I cared more about that, like, tiny subplot than anything else in the book. And then I don't even remember how it tied in, and I remember thinking, like, that was unsatisfying.
Yeah.
There was a lot of characters. The characters, I don't think were, I feel like this is what a lot of people have said, but their characters were really underdeveloped, and or for me, while I was reading, I didn't care what happened to them. And relationships, also, I wasn't convinced, and I don't know. I just, super, super disappointing. And the writing was lyrical, but I didn't like the story at all. And I don't know if it was, like, over my head. I just, like, I did not get on board. And this is not a short book. I read the whole thing. It is I think just over 500 pages. And I didn't like it. So
I'm going to borrow it from her, though.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll see if I like it more.
Yeah. So the 6th question is, what is the biggest surprise?
So my biggest surprise, I don't have it with me, but it's The 13th Tale by Diane Satterfield. And this is a book that was recommended to me from a friend who, we were talking about how we really like gothic novels and gothic stories and just like that vibe of like creepy, ooh. And so she recommended it to me, and I also love books about books and books about authors. And so this follows the story of an aging author who has her life is really mysterious. I know Chantel has this book, but
don't tell me too much, because I want to pick it up and I don't know.
Okay, so there's an aging author, and she has told various stories about her history, her life history, and where she comes from. And everyone is like, what is your life? Where did you come from? Who are you? And so at the end of her life, she hires a biographer to tell her story. And so it's this process of uncovering her story, and the biographer is also uncovering her story because she has some questions about her birth as well and her young life. And there's a lot of, it's just like, I was not expecting anything really when I picked it up, and I loved it so much. It's written beautifully. It's creepy but not scary, and there's like twins and feral children and like old creepy houses, and I love all of those things. So that was my biggest surprise of this year, just because I had no expectations going into it, and I absolutely loved it.
I'm excited to pick that up.
Yeah, because Chantel, you love reading about twins, right?
I don't know if I've ever read about twins, but I love the concept and the idea of twins.
I don't know why I have it in my head that you love.
I love twins.
Because Chantel always watches YouTube videos about twins, right?
Or like my biggest regret in life is not having an identical twin.
You'll like this book.
I'm excited. My biggest surprise for the year was Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. I picked this up, actually we picked this up together during quarantine. I've been wanting to pick up more sci-fi, and this comes highly recommended. And I didn't have high expectations of it because it's about video games. I'm not super into video games, but I loved this book so much. I was talking about earlier how I love characters. The main character of this book is wonderful. And some of the friendships he develops in this virtual reality world are so sweet, and there's a couple reveals towards the end about some of the other people in the virtual world, and I loved this book. I loved the characters. I love the journey that they go on. So this is set in the distant future of 2044, where reality is an ugly place and a lot of people escape into virtual reality with headsets, and they have like avatars, and they're in this world role playing as whoever they want to be. A lot of people have the ability to go to the virtual school there, and so they have this virtual presence that may be different than their actual persona, and so that was an interesting aspect. And the premise of this book is a quest that some of these characters go on to find this all-encompassing like holy grail prize, and I loved the characters and some of the trials that they had to go through and the friendships. I was so surprised. I did not think I was gonna like this as much as I did, and this is another one that I'm really excited to reread. Number 7 is a favorite new author, either debut or new to you.
I don't have one. A lot of the books that I read this year were either authors that I've already read or books where I've only read or authors where I've only read one of their books, and so I can't say I have a new favorite author based on only reading,
You could do a debut author though.
But I don't think I've read anything by a debut author.
It is Chantel from the editing room again. Heather wanted me to pop in and say that she did read a bunch of great books by debut authors this year, and the one that she would select for this question is The 13th Tale by Diane Sutterfield.
That you liked, yeah.
Or at all. Oh, no, I did. Rory Power.
Yeah.
No. And, yeah, no.
For this one, I'm going to go with Frederick Bachman. Last year, I read My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry, which was a gift I received from a dear friend for my birthday. And then this year, I read Beartown. Both of those stories have that interwoven element of different storylines coming together, and they're loosely tied, but you don't know how it's going to all come together, and then at the end it's just everything fits right. It's well done, it's well thought out. I think the craft of his writing is so good, and those books are translated, and so the translator also has done a really good job. I just love them, so I can't wait to pick up more of his work. And actually, Heather and I have a man called Ove here. Heather and I are picking this up to do a book talk soon, so be on the lookout for that. Question 8 is newest fictional crush.
I don't typically crush on fictional people. The only two people that I've ever really crushed on were Ron Weasley and Hermione from Harry Potter when I was a child, figuring out love. And yes, I don't know if I don't read a lot of romance. I don't read a lot of books where that's a main focus necessarily, or it's something that I'm reading for. So I just don't think about it.
I also don't have a fictional crush. And I have read some romance, and there are definitely characters who have qualities that I admire, that I think are so funny or so smart or so witty, but I wouldn't say I crush. So
I guess if I had to choose a friend crush, I read Great Expectations this year, and I really liked Joe, who is a father figure, and he's just like a kind, honest soul, and there's like no sparks in my adoration of him, you know, but he's just like, I want that man in my life. Like, he's a good man. But that's pretty much it.
Yeah. Question 9 is your newest favorite character.
So kind of going off the Great Expectations thing, by Charles Dickens. I read that earlier this year. We actually read it together. We were supposed to do like a book club. Chantel never finished it. It took me a while to finish it because we were reading it in quarantine, and it at first just like wasn't what I was feeling, but I ended up loving the story. And my favorite character from that was Biddy. Well, I love Joe, obviously, but Biddy, who is this intensely intelligent and kind woman who knows how to, she just like knows her way around the world of like talking to people in ways that will resonate with them. And she was just like the epitome. I mean, she's set up to be the epitome of like a good, kind heart in a woman, and like intelligence and all of those things. And I adored her. And her and Joe together, like watching them interact was like, this is all of the goodness in the world. And I adored it.
I have a couple favorite characters, one of which is Danielle from Shadow of the Wind. I also loved Shug and Seely from The Color Purple, but we've mentioned those two. So I also want to talk about Chains from The Lies of Locke Lamora. Heather and I read this together during quarantine, separate. And I had heard a lot about the lies of Locke Lamora and the story, and how it was a revenge story with dual timelines. It involves organized crime, like really witty characters, the banter between the characters throughout this novel. And I did not get on board with our main character Locke for a while, but I loved Chains, who is a father figure to these boys, and I just loved the way that he spoke with them, or spoke to them, and treated them as adults even when they were younger. I just felt like there was such a respect that he had for them while he was nurturing them in this life of crime, and nurturing Locke's love of crime and deceit. And it was just I found his character just fun, and I loved him. Question 10 is a book that made you cry.
So I don't have it here, but I chose On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong, and this was his debut novel. It was so beautifully written, and it's from the perspective of a character named Little Dog, and he's writing a letter to his mother, just like talking about his experience. And he is a Vietnamese gay man, and he is just like uncovering his identity, and it was just so heart-wrenching and so beautiful, and dealt with a lot of like, you know, masculinity and class and immigration and coming out, and all of these really hard-hitting topics in a really beautifully written way. And I got all the feels for that book, and I highly recommend it, as Pride Month is almost over, but it's just an amazing book any time of the year.
Yeah. I don't often cry in books, but a book that did make me cry was The Color Purple. I cried at the end. happy tears. I loved this book. Number 11 is a book that made you happy.
This is a book that Chantel kind of briefly talked about earlier, but I read My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry by Frederick Blackman during quarantine, and it is a story about a young girl who lives in this flat, and her grandma lives across the hall, and her grandma's crazy and eccentric, and they're best friends. And the little girl in the story, Elsa, she is, you know, a little different from other kids, and her grandma passes away, and it deals with Elsa going through the grieving process, and her grandma has left her this like scavenger hunt of apologies to make, and getting to know everyone within her building. And it made me sad cry, and it made me happy cry, and it was just a really beautiful story about not judging a book by its cover, not judging a person by their cover, and everyone has stories that we don't know. And that's kind of how I like to approach life, is I don't know you. And just like, it just made me so happy to see this little girl learning that lesson really early in her life, and to be able to deal with grief in such a like fun way.
So for this prompt, I chose Eliza and Her Monsters. This is a YA book. This book follows our main character, Eliza, who is very introverted. She is the creator of an online comic called Monstrous Sea, and she has this online persona called Lady Constellation. So she's super popular and famous in an online world, and people know her for her art and her story, but in her real world, like her family doesn't even know how big her comic's gotten, and people at school who are reading her comic don't know she's the creator. And it's a really sweet, slow burn love story between Eliza and a new boy at school who writes fan fiction for her comic. And it was really, really sweet, and a really light read, but also dealt with some heavier topics in a really palatable way. And it made me smile. I loved it so much. Number 12 is the most beautiful book you've bought or received this year.
So mine, I don't have it with me, but it is the 4th book in the Cemetery of Forgotten book series, which is the Shadow of the Wind series. And I'll put a picture here. I bought this book during quarantine. You can see the pattern. And it's gorgeous. I love like simple monochrome covers. And then the other one that I have that I love as well is Middlesex. This is another book that I don't have here, but I'll put it there. It's another monochrome cover that I got during quarantine. And I just love, I don't know, simple, elegant covers.
Yeah. For this book, I'm going to go with Amal Unbound. I love this one because it's like the illustrated trend that's going around right now, but I love the colors of it. And it's kind of simple, but I just think it's so beautiful. So
it's like the complete opposite of black.
Question 13 is, what books do you need to read by the end of the year?
So I have a lot of books that I'm going to read by the end of the year. Most important is Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Rani Lodge. I know that Chantel has read this, highly recommends it, as do so many other people. But I really need to get to this book sooner rather than later. I also really want to get to In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. This is a memoir about an abusive female relationship, and I just really want to read it. I'm trying to get more into memoirs, and this one, I don't know, I just want to read it. I also want to start a new epic fantasy series this year, because I have been like waiting for the Game of Thrones 6th book to come out, which it's never going to, and the 4th Gentleman Bastard series book to come out, and I just need to move on until that happens. So I'm going to read the Kingkiller Chronicles, The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. I have a bunch of fantasy series that I want to get to, but I've never read anything by Patrick Rothfuss, and Chantel has this too, so it's something that we can buddy read together. And the last that we both want to get to by the end of the year is the rest of the books in the Cemetery of Forgotten Books series. So Angel's Game, which is a prequel to Shadow of the Wind, but came out after. And then The Prisoner of Heaven, and the 4th book, which is Labyrinth of the Spirits. So that's something that we both want to read by the end of 2020.
Heather, you've read both of those books before.
So
I have not. So
these two and Shadow of the Wind are rereads for me, but I have not read the 4th book yet. But I read these so long ago that I want to reread them before getting to the 4th book.
I'm so excited to pick up those books. I think I want to pick them up sooner rather than later. And then some of the other books I want to read by the end of the year is just books that I've started throughout the year and just haven't picked up, which includes Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. I also have a book called Period Power by, I believe it's Maisie Hill, but I will correct myself if that's not right. And then I have started I have a really bad habit of starting series. I'll pick up the first book in a series and not continue on. So I have a couple series that I would like to get through. So I read Scythe this year, so I'd like to pick up Thunderhead and the Toll. And I also started, or I think I read last year, A Discovery of Witches, and I want to pick up the 2 next books in that series, which I have, and
there's just always so many good books to read. It's hard.
Yeah, so finishing up some of those series and the books that I've started this year.
Cool. So that's our mid-year book freak out. It's the end of June. It's insane. And it's my birthday.
Hey! Happy birthday!
Thanks.
We will see you next week for a new video. Thanks for watching.
Bye. Did you hear my stomach?
This lighting though?
I know.
This lighting though? So the 4th question is... Oh. Did I get this year? Sounds like a dog toy.
Does like a sound.
See you...